You know, it's scenes like this that make Final Fantasy XVI work. For all its hectic combat, convoluted political intrigue, and grandiose mythology, for all its cast bloat, melodrama, and good old-fashioned god-killing JRPG sensibilities, it's the quiet, lovingly rendered, deeply emotional moments like this that make you almost forget that these two are technically adoptive siblings. Final Fantasy XVI is a very good game, and I like it a lot. I was cautious going in, only ever having played Final Fantasy XV and not having enjoyed it on account of it being bad and whatnot, but 16's opening hit me like a freight train, and I never stopped having a good time playing it. The combat was consistently engaging, even if it struggled to stay fresh. The soundtrack has rocketed to number 3 on my list all time, no, that is not too high, and the story is, before you get your pitchforks out, really quite good. I know fans of the series weren't all thrilled about how cinematic it was, but as an objective observer, I think they really nailed a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And despite the opening of this video, I actually think most of the weird relationships do more good than harm. In fact, some of them make up the pillars that hold this story up. So, which is which? Well, the easiest way to break it down is directly through the eyes of Clive. So, step into your edgiest oversized boots and really hold back those tears, because all your dads are gonna die. Among the hallmarks of the varying hero's journeys are the death of a father figure as an inciting incident, the death of a mentor as a motivating plot beat, anywhere from crossing the threshold all the way to the ordeal, or even the slaying of the father symbolically or literally in the climactic revelation. Clive Rossfield, God bless his poor aching soul, hits the trifecta with tragedy to spare. See, while Clive's character arc is pretty blatantly about brotherhood, what with ripping his baby brother's bird neck out and wasting half the game looking for the maniac hall monitor, his persona is effectively boy failure, a walking shadow who helplessly fills the space of his 3 increasingly influential dads, Elwyn, Sid, and then Ultima. Elwyn doesn't stick around for long, but he's instrumental in Clive's emotional makeup. He is, by all accounts, a pretty good dad, maybe a bit easily distracted, but by sympathizing with Clive, he fosters the much more important relationship between his sons, and he motivates Clive both to strive for personal growth and for a better world, without, magic slavery and stuff. The society here is a little bit goofy, but Elwyn is the inciting dad. His love informs Clive's hopes and dreams, as well as his underlying insecurities, and his death kickstarts the plot. 7 out of 10 dad. Should have kept his head on a swivel, and probably picked a better wife. Which means it's time for the Annabella tangent. Annabella is not a dad, but she occupies this beloved space in JRPG storytelling of the cover heel, the villain you spend most of the story mad at who dies about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the game before you fight God. Rufus Shinra, Shido from Persona 5, you know this role. It's the best role. They're always a proxy or a patsy, so there's so much room to be so comically, mustache-twirlingly evil, and Annabella just eats it up. Her sheer unbridled hatred for Clive for simply not being a demigod, her obsession with power and status, her convoluted schemes, and absolutely bonkers death scene. They inject a level of Saturday morning cartoon that really softens Clive's edge. The sheer amount of burden he bears is easier to swallow when you as the player see that most of the political silliness is just on account of what a monster Annabella is. Her status as a puppet of Ultima also essentially both legitimizes her and dehumanizes her, making it more sensible and fun to hate her. A massive chunk of the plot outside of Clive's personal journey is held aloft by Annabella, and she deserves credit for that, in addition to the damage she does to Clive emotionally, requiring at least another full dad to fix. Speaking of, how about Sid? Sid is a classic mentor archetype. Gruff but charming, sensitive but swashbuckling, a terrible father to his real daughter, but eager for a protege to sacrifice himself for, and God does Clive fit that particular bill. But what makes Sid interesting as a mentor figure is that he has his own pair of shoes to fill. Because Sid is so naturally compelling as a character and so strong in his convictions, the story is able to use him as a crutch to lurch its plot forward by making him the second in a line of dads for Clive to live up to. What we get with Sid is another self-assured father figure sympathizing with Clive and seeing in him the potential to be greater than the failure he thinks he is, with the vision to create a better world where people like Clive don't have to think of themselves as failures in the first place. Instead of a second son to protect, however, Sid comes with a whole hideout full of revolutionaries. This dynamic, naturally, has a lot more meat on its bones. We spend more time with Sid, he's better able to sympathize with Clive since they're both dominants, and Ralph Ineson's performance does a lot of the heavy lifting to ingratiate the player to him.
You might as well make yourself useful.
What it amounts to, at least ostensibly, is another sacrifice, another dead dad, and a bigger shadow to step out of. But if you look at Clive's journey as one of self-actualization, then this is his false transformation. Having recently come to terms with his role as a dominant and his brother's killer, the mentor is no longer needed. Sid's sacrifice and introduction of the true villain would, in a normal story, lead directly to the climax, in which Clive's newfound sense of peace would give him the strength necessary to overcome the odds. But this isn't a normal story. Clive has self-realized, but not self-actualized. He still has another dad. Now, Ultima is, as far as villains go, not half bad. I think it's truly interesting how early he's introduced, and his role as the father that must be overcome in a sort of classical mythology sense. It's a very fitting way to cap off Clive's story. The dramatic irony that Clive must fail as a vessel for his divine father, his creator, to take control of his own fate and to redeem his failures in the missions of his last two fathers, it's thematically poignant, and that's more than you can ask for with most JRPG villains specifically. His plan is a little convoluted, and it's arguable he hangs around vaguely menacing Clive for too much of the story as opposed to remaining a near-complete mystery or becoming more actively involved, like, say, Sephiroth. But these are minor issues with what is, by all accounts, a creative and unusual exploitation of numerous patriarchal storytelling tropes to stitch together one man's story of becoming man enough himself to die tragically and leave loved ones behind. But wait, this time it is different. It's not his son. It's just his sister wife. The overwhelming majority of complaints about Final Fantasy XVI's story regarded general diversity and, more intensely, the treatment of its female characters. Now, general diversity is something you're either in or you're out on. There's no really arguing whether it's there or not, but the female cast, this is something we can explore, and really, they are pretty lame. I want to break this down from the top because I think it's pretty clear the flaws inherent to the female cast all stem from them being built around Clive and Joshua's stories, with Jill being the sort of coup de grace, somehow not working in a role that is, to my understanding, a strong one in a lot of Final Fantasy games. The principal female cast consists of Annabella, Jill, Benedicta, Taria, Vivian, Mid, and Yote. It's possible some of the side characters get extra development through side quests, but I don't know, because the other bad thing about Final Fantasy XVI is all the side quests suck. So let's blast through the back four with all the love and care they're shown by the game. Yote barely even counts. She exists because we need the dramatic irony of knowing Joshua's hanging around near Clive without Clive knowing. So Joshua needs a physical extension to interact with the world for him in the form of an attendant. She's a prop, which paradoxically kind of only looks bad because there's so few female characters in the game. Taria and Viv are exposition machines, Viv more literally than Taria, but neither particularly matter in the grand scheme of things. Viv's role could have been a general political update after every main quest provided by, say, Gav. Vanillaware's Unicorn Overlord did a really similar thing and nobody complained. Taria being a doctor and also being another person who knew the real Sid makes her slightly more interesting, but she really only exists because someone needs to tell you Jill is too sick to help. She doesn't even have like a metagame UI purpose, which means realistically, she and the lore guy could have been one character. Or the shopkeep, whom I forgot is also a woman. Anyway, that just leaves Mid, a character who absolutely should have mattered a lot, and not just because she has a Yorkie accent. Sid having an actual biological daughter is somehow in no way relevant to the way he interacts with Clive, or the way Clive interacts with her after Sid dies and Clive takes up his mantle and even his name. That there is nothing interesting to say about Mid is a travesty, and a deeply unnecessary one. She never meets Sid's only past connection, Benedicta. She has like one scene of boat captaining, and the stuff she engineers could have, again, been anyone else's domain. The blacksmith, the shopkeep, fucking goons. The Enterprise could have been a gift from whatever stupid order Yote is a part of. At least then they would matter. The problem Final Fantasy XVI has with its female cast is not one of having too few characters. It's that each of them exists to fill one little role the story kind of needed to make full sense. Clive knows too many people, and they're simply too spread out for any one to functionally fill the heroine role. What's confusing and even kind of irritating about it is that I think this was a relatively easy fix, because the real closest thing to a girlfriend that Clive has isn't Jill. It's just Gav. This is not about any romantic chemistry between Clive and Gav, although make no mistake, they absolutely have romantic chemistry. It's just that the narrative beats that traditionally belong to the heroine often go to Gav, because the game frequently sidelines Jill thanks to her plot-convenient lithification. Somebody has to do the banter and the bonding and the fussing over Clive while Jill lies catatonic in her hospital bed. And I really like Gav, but considering the size of the cast and their increasingly convoluted relations to each other, it's weird that he exists. It feels like his entire purpose is to give the player a different buddy to talk to when Jill is predisposed, but if that is the case, why isn't it just Mid? Why isn't Gav just Mid? Not only would it add layers of character to spend time with Mid and Sid together before his death, it would add tension to know that Sid endangers his daughter for the cause, and complicate Mid's relationship to Clive and Jill knowing that they are far, far more useful to Sid's cause than she could ever be. And even that as a pseudo-solution wouldn't begin to fix the Jill problem, which is much bigger and more difficult to dig the story out of. The fact that Jill spends most of the early game in a coma, and then even after Sid's death and the time skip is forced to split Clive time with Gav like a divorcee, rips away what little time there is to flesh her out in a story that is very much not about her and Clive to begin with. The irony of Jill is that in a cast flooded with characters who have one barely justifiable connection to Clive, Jill is too many things at once. When we meet her, she has already known Clive for years, a political prisoner turned ward turned adoptive daughter of Rosaria from a nation now collapsed. She is also immediately set up as the main love interest, which to me is objectively weird. I know it's not incest, but when you're writing fiction, you don't need to make it anywhere near that close. Jill is off-screen for the Sanbreque ambush, then is reunited with Clive after 13 years apart, during which she was a slave to a completely unrelated nation because she's also a dominant. They do not recognize each other and fight, so Jill then spends several full story missions sick in bed before finally reuniting with Clive properly. They get a scene together, and then Sid dies, and we get another 5-year off-camera time skip, in which we can assume they spend a lot of time together, yet their dynamic barely changes, and their relationship does not tangibly progress. By the time you get to the beach scene and these two adoptive siblings have sex, it is somehow both still weird and mostly unearned. Throughout their story, there is the conventional language of a bond and romantic tension, but no structure to it, no substantial evidence. It's a veneer. It wants you to do the narrative work. That's a problem, and it's a Clive problem. Jill is the heroine, the main love interest, a dominant, victim of two separate tragic backstories, one of which is the entire point of a main story excursion and completes Jill's half-baked arc literally right after she is upgraded to sidekick, giving her very little to do for the rest of the game except get kidnapped. And yet, she is not only not the co-protagonist, but is gifted the flaw of being physically frail and therefore constantly sidelined. Jill could be an interesting character. Her sense of homeland is shattered from a young age. Her time as a political prisoner and then as a slave soldier should inform her perspective on being a human weapon. But there isn't time to develop her properly, so instead she just gets jerked around by the plot. In the extremely specific sense that Clive's story requires him to accept vulnerability to achieve perfect boy failure, Jill's role in the Waylude arc at the very least serves to highlight the theme. But one good scene does not a good character make. It's probably too much to ask for Clive to simply not have a love interest in this JRPG, even if it is primarily about family ties. But why there wasn't just a love interest is far beyond me, and is, to me at least, Final Fantasy XVI's biggest flaw. Jill is frustrating because you feel the strings of the story tightening around her, and even if you can't quite put your finger on it, you keep twitching every time someone less important has a seemingly interesting conversation with Clive. Jill is a Frankenstein's monster in a cute little musketeer outfit, stitched together from every piece of Clive's story that happened to be missing, unable to be a character because she's too busy being a solution. Functionally speaking, to narratively unfuck this cluster, Mid should have been older, more involved in the Resistance, and the main love interest. Jill should have sacrificed herself to give Clive ice powers, and to keep things at least competently paced, Dion probably should have just died way earlier, because really, his boss fight is awesome, but why on earth does he stick around so long, if not just to purposely sideline Jill so that the love interest gets to live? I didn't talk about Benedicta. You don't care, do you? Can we just talk about Joshua now? There are so many tenuous narrative connections that spiderweb this 30-hour Game of Thrones cosplay, from the vaguely political to the implicitly divine and possibly metaphorical. It's very easy to get lost in Clive's various savior complexes. That's why it's so refreshing, and in fact so impactful, whenever push comes to shove and the story becomes about Joshua again, and Clive turns into a rabid, foaming, wild animal. Joshua is the load-bearing pillar of Final Fantasy XVI. If all of Clive's insecurity, and therefore all of his setup as a character, is siphoned through his various father figures, then all of his strength, and therefore all of his development as a character, is siphoned through Joshua. A better way to look at this dichotomy thematically is, while Clive represents a manic, desperate, and self-destructive ideal of self-sacrifice, Joshua represents true heroism, someone who cherishes life and recognizes both the value and the weight of sacrifice in harmony. Boyhood Joshua is an absolute cinnamon roll, a wide-eyed, sugary sweet, perfect beacon of light. If you're familiar with the idea of the save the cat moment, the early scene wherein the protagonist coincidentally exhibits the fundamental reason you're supposed to root for them, Boyhood Joshua is essentially a save the cat character. It's a clever device because on the one hand, it works. Clive is obviously a good brother, and Joshua is obviously worthy of that much love. Therefore, it will be devastating and life-changing for Clive when he's killed. But on the other hand, it subtly sets the expectation for the player that Clive will never be living for himself on a fundamental level, which is his defining flaw, and unlike the shame of failing as his brother's protector, it can't be overcome by the sheer revelation of Joshua surviving. Well, he doesn't so much survive as he does revive, because he's the Phoenix, the dominant of life, which is as much an integral part of Clive's idealization of him as it is of his actual character. In the 13 years we don't see him, Joshua grows into his responsibility, gifted the virtues of compassion and patience by his unique perspective on life and death, using them to do what no one in all of Valisthea has ever had the clarity of mind to do. Study the giant fucking ruins that litter the continent. This helps make adult Joshua compelling as a walking MacGuffin. While Clive is turning the continent upside down hoping to bump into him, Joshua is inarguably getting shit done. And there's both dramatic irony in his inability to reunite with Clive because he's keeping Ultima and his purple chest tumor, and narrative intrigue in what time we are given with him, because we as the audience are not allowed to know exactly what he's up to. It tries its hardest to reverse their dynamic too, but there's a tension pulling against it. Clive. Late-game Joshua and Clive is the best writing Final Fantasy XVI has to offer. In a story about sacrifice and savior complexes, the two of them subtly competing to be the protector in their relationship is as tragic as it is heartfelt. culminating in Joshua's sacrifice, which is by a wide margin the most impactful moment in the game. I said before that one good scene does not a good character make, but good character work absolutely elevates a good scene to great. Does that make sense? When I look back on my earlier assertion that Jill shouldn't have been a love interest and should have sacrificed herself for Clive, or at least died before the end, this is the best argument against it. Because Joshua's sacrifice is so monumental in a version of this story where every death has felt so unnecessary, it serves as the moment of Clive's self-actualization. This is where he comes to understand what his role really is, that destruction is not intrinsically evil. With that knowledge, Clive can accept that the time has come for him to make a true sacrifice. The caste bloat and dizzying political associations of Final Fantasy XVI, while they don't break the game, are undeniably flaws in its structural makeup. But they are understandable at worst and borderline thematically valuable at best when viewed through the lens of the brotherhood at the core of the story. If nothing else, after all, can it not be said that to be loved and needed by so many people did nothing to avail Clive in his struggle against self-loathing, and that it was in fact not the love and kindness of even his brother which finally brought him peace, but simply to see him at peace in death, and to know that peace may come before death, and not in death? I don't know, because the game makes it intentionally unclear whether either of them are actually dead in the end. Perhaps the most fitting and possible to a story about the meaning of sacrifice and not the act itself. I like to imagine they both survive, and Phoenix Joshua carries Clive across the ocean and back to the hideout, and everyone's cheering and crying, and Jill runs over and kisses Clive passionately, and Joshua goes, "Wait, you guys had sex? That's fucking weird."